This is from Karen Thomas' website, Naturally Recovering Autism. I put the link in the description. And she addresses the histamine reactions in connection to autism, which I find very important, because if you clear up your histamine sensitivities, it's a big game changer. For me, it was the DAO supplement, and since then I didn't experience any bad histamine reactions, meaning no migraines. And that's really such a relief.
Hi there, and welcome to Naturally Recovering Autism. I'm your host, Karen Thomas, and I want to thank you for being here, being a proactive parent, and getting the resources that you need to help your child get the optimum results in autism recovery. And there is a lot to know, and as you know, I've recovered my own son, and I've been through this journey myself, and it took me over a decade to figure it out. After being told that my son could not recover and that I should drug him and try behavioral therapies, but I didn't want to do that because of my natural background in craniosacral therapy. I knew that the brain could heal. So fortunately, like you, I went out and I gathered the resources that I needed, and I continued, and I didn't give up, and today my son's fully recovered, and now I want to be there to share these resources with you so you can get the optimum results for your child, whatever they may be. And I've created a free online workshop called the 4 Stages to Naturally Recover from Autism, and it's for you to learn what is necessary, because it's much more than just diet. And I want to make sure you know everything that needs to happen for full recovery. Stage 1 is healing the gut. Stage 2 is natural heavy metal detoxification. Stage 3 is clearing the co-infections like mold, Lyme, strep. And then stage 4 is the brain support and repair. And these are all important factors, not just one alone. So I want to make sure that you're able to, I can explain that to you in this free workshop, and then you can register at naturallyrecoveringautism.com/free workshop, and that is available to you right now. So please take advantage of it. And I'm excited that you're here because, again, today we have a special guest with us, Dr. Beth O'Hara, and I'll give you a little bit of her background in a moment. We've had Dr. Beth O'Hara on before where we talked about mast cell activation, and we'll explain that to you again today, because today's topic is on histamine sensitivities in autism. And now these are really, really important. They can be some of the reasons why your child continues to have physical health issues, especially things like skin rashes and eczema, etc., but also why they have behavioral outbursts of anger, or they can't sleep. And histamines can be one of the big triggers, but you have to know, when those things are arising. So we're going to give you some good background and some solutions today, and explain all of that for you so that you can know more for your own child. Dr. Beth O'Hara is a functional naturopath specializing in complex chronic health conditions related to mast cell activation, including autism spectrum disorders, mold toxicity, histamine intolerance, and chemical sensitivities. She is the founder and owner of Mast Cell 360, a functional naturopathy practice designed to look at all factors surrounding health conditions: genetic, biochemical, mental, emotional, social, and environmental. She is a doctoral candidate in functional naturopathy through the New Eden School of Natural Health, and she holds a master's degree in marriage and family therapy and a bachelor's in physiology, psychology. She is certified in functional genomic analysis, and she is research advisor for the Nutrigenomic Research Institute. She presents at functional medicine conferences and will be speaking next at the 2019 Environmental Toxins and Genomics Conference. And Beth, I'd like to welcome you, and again, I appreciate you being here, and I really appreciate your time and your expertise in these subjects, and helping to share these resources with these parents who have children with autism. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks so much, Karen. I'm really excited that we can team up together and really help a lot of kids' lives here.
Yeah, absolutely, and make a difference, because it is literally about life-changing results that can happen for children. So why don't we start from the beginning? Okay, a lot of people, and I will link to today's show notes at naturallyrecoveringautism.com/50. Today is show number 50. That's very exciting. But I do want to make sure that you know that the links that we talked about are there. So if you're driving your car or you're out on a walk, that you can find the links there, because I'll link to Beth's resources as well, and our last episode on mast cell activation. So Beth, maybe as we're talking about histamine intolerance and explaining that, also just give a little bit of background on mast cell activation.
Yeah, for sure. I'd be happy to go into that. How about we start with what histamine is?
Okay.
Okay. So our bodies naturally make histamine, and histamine is also found in many foods. And histamine is made in the body by mast cells, which is a type of immune cell. There's a couple of others as well that make histamine, but mast cells are the best known. And histamine is a really important part of the immune response. So I want to emphasize that histamine is not the enemy, just like mast cells are not the enemy. So we need histamine for our bodies to work properly. And histamine is involved in opening the blood vessels so the white blood cells can enter to attack foreign invaders. It's involved as a neurotransmitter and helps regulate sleep. It's involved in the reproductive cycles and cardiovascular systems and the respiratory and digestive systems. It's really critical in our bodies, but just like anything, too much of a good thing is too much, as though too much histamine can cause problems. So histamine intolerance is where the body has more histamine than it can break down. And there's two main pathways that we'll talk about in the body that break down histamine, two lesser known pathways. And if any of those pathways aren't working, histamine can build up to high levels and cause symptoms. And the way this histamine intolerance is related to mast cell activation syndrome is that those mast cells, again, release histamine, but they can also release over 200 different inflammatory molecules. Histamine is just the best known. So mast cell activation syndrome happens when the immune cells become overreactive, overresponsive, which can happen in chronic infections, chronic stress, toxicity. So a number of factors that can impact that immune system. So that's mast cell activation syndrome is when the mast cells are overproducing inflammation in general, whereas histamine intolerance is an issue just with not being able to keep up with the histamine load and break it down.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So, so when you get histamine intolerance, or what can cause it? What can be some of the reasons? And of course, we'll look at some of the symptoms as well that parents can look for.
Sure. So there's a number of causes, and what's interesting is they're very similar to what can cause mast cell activation syndrome. And I want to back up and say that people can have just histamine intolerance, or they can have just mast cell activation syndrome. A lot of times people have both. So I often see in my practice when people think they just have histamine intolerance, they often also have mast cell activation syndrome, especially people on the autism spectrum. I frequently see both, and we can talk about that. But mast cell activation syndrome is extremely, extremely common with the autism spectrum disorders. So some of the things that can cause histamine intolerance are really high histamine diets, medications that block histamine enzymes, gut issues, and genetic issues. So we can get into more detail on those.
Most kids with autism do have low nutrients and low absorption of their food because their gut's not working properly. So they're not absorbing the nutrition even if they're eating good food. So low nutrients would be next. What would you have to say about those and histamine sensitivities?
So we know specifically that things like low omega-3 fatty acids, not enough saturated fat, low B6, low B12, Dysregulated iron, and that's a whole topic on itself, is the iron regulation, and low copper. These are cofactors for these histamine degrading enzymes. Magnesium is big, zinc is a big one. And so if we don't have those, even if we don't have genetic variants in methylation or for HNMT or for the DAO enzyme, then people can have functional issues with those enzymes.
Again, eating a meat-based diet is highly beneficial. Eat your meat.
Hormone disruptions and stress and EMFs. So that's a lot of root causes, and they're really similar also in mast cell activation syndrome. And then when I think about autism spectrum disorders, they're the same root causes that we see there. So it's all overlapping there.
Yeah, and they're food intolerances, and most of our kids with autism have low nutrients because their guts aren't working properly, so they have poor absorption. So they are usually mineral deficient, etc. And mold is one of the big triggers for autism as well, the mold biotoxin issue. And then you mentioned EMF, so why don't we go through these, like you said, individually, because they're all individually important. So can you give us a little background on each then?
Yeah, for sure. So let's start with the high histamine foods. And because we're talking about histamine intolerance, I'm going to hone in here on high histamine foods. But when we look at mast cell activation syndrome, involvement with this and involvement with autism spectrum disorders, of course, we have other things like oxalates and glutamates that can be a factor. But if we're just looking at the histamine foods, I see a lot of people, on the autism spectrum often getting worse symptoms with the gut healing protocols that are out there. They use a lot of fermented vegetables and bone broth and things like kefir and kombucha. And I'm not saying that, those are bad or nobody should have them. If you don't have histamine issues, those are wonderful gut healing tools. But if you have histamine issues, they cause worse symptoms. And I got way worse myself when I started eating all of those foods. I started getting a lot of itching, my sleep got worse, I was getting increased inflammation. And this was back 15 years ago, before anyone was talking about histamine intolerance and mast cell activation. So it took a really long time for me to figure out that's what was going on. And one of the things that can be tricky about figuring out if your child has histamine intolerance is that the reactions can be delayed up to 2 days. So some people have immediate reactions, but some people it's about that histamine bucket and the total levels building and building in the body. And so if your child has bone broth one day but doesn't have anything for high histamine, they might be fine. But the next day they had bone broth and some fish and some ground meat and some strawberries, then that might tip the bucket and make the histamine bucket overflow. So that's one of the things there is this high histamine consumption. And also in our modern society, we eat a lot of packaged foods. We eat a lot of processed foods. Meat might sit around in the grocery for several days or even sometimes 7 to 10 days before we buy it. And so that the histamine levels in our foods are much higher than they used to be. So that's one piece. Then the next piece has to do with these histamine degrading enzymes. So I'm going to talk about the two major ones, which are DAO, and that stands for diamine oxidase, and then HNMT, and that stands for histamine N-methyltransferase. And then there's two other pathways involving MAO and acetylation. But if we focus on these two major ones, so the DAO is made in the brush border cells of the gut. And anything that causes intestinal inflammation is going to affect DAO production. So this can be things like wheat and dairy or any other foods that are inflammatory to your child. So that's going to cause gut inflammation. That's going to affect that DAO production. Any kind of gut infections, whether we're talking about SIBO, Candida, Clostridia infections, some of the viral gut infections, anything like that is going to cause inflammation, affect DAO. and even digestive issues where we have lack of the right digestive enzymes, like not enough betaine HCl, or not enough of the fat degrading enzymes or the carbohydrate degrading enzymes, some of the pancreatic enzymes. This will affect DAO production. And so DAO is really breaking that histamine down in the gut before it can get through the intestinal wall into the bloodstream. And we need quite a bit of DAO to be able to keep up with our histamine. And then that other enzyme, HNMT, is involved with methylation. And there's an oversimplification that's occurred around histamine and methylation, which has been people have thought that undermethylation equals histamine intolerance, overmethylation equals no histamine issues. And this is because methylation is needed to make that HNMT enzyme work. So if you don't have enough methyl donors, HNMT doesn't work. If you have a lot of methyl donors, so you're overmethylated, HNMT should be working better. But unfortunately, it's not that simple. So I see plenty of clients who are overmethylated, have histamine issues, and it may be because of the DAO enzyme or some other factors. So we can't go with that simplification that's been out there for a long time. And I just want to really point that out because I had a client on the autism spectrum who he's 16, I think he's 17 now. And when he first came in to see me, it had been assumed that because he was on the spectrum, he must be undermethylated, and he was put on histamine raising supplements because of that assumption, and it wasn't true for him. So he was on high dose niacin and some other things to bring that histamine up. He was so agitated, Karen, he couldn't hardly sit still. He had to pace. He was just having major histamine reactions. His skin was flushing. If he just had a little scratch, it would be red and swollen. So when we switched those supplements, things started to calm down.
Yeah, that's that. I even noticed that you mentioned fermented foods, and we can talk about foods in more detail in the show as well. But if I have even too much kombucha, I'll notice that it really affects me because I have the histamine sensitivity. So I just really limit my intake. And when parents come into my program, they're always thinking, should I give them a bunch of fermented foods? I'm like, no, maybe try a tablespoon and see how it goes. Stay with for pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder, and if it's PANDAS, it's associated with strep. So basically, we just sort of short line it to PANS or a strep flare-up. What happens when this goes on is that the immune system basically attacks the brain. Now, most of us carry strep in our systems, but what happens is, especially when we're immune compromised, when we have any type of environmental trigger or stressor, then we can have a PANS flare up. And she said her son's all of a sudden, now what this means for you, if you're not familiar with it, is anxiety attacks. All of a sudden, you'll see a sudden onset of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. They're really clingy. They might start wetting the bed again. A lot of these things can have to do with the anxiousness. And that can trigger just as an environmental trigger can, a food or something in our environment to pesticides, etc. So while you're at home with your child, please do keep them away from other people and for you to avoid others just during this time as much as you can. But hopefully you're in a place where you have a yard and you can take your child outside into the backyard or just stay at least 6 feet away from other people. Also, I want to make sure you know for strengthening the immune system, and we'll talk about some of that today because the picky eating issue and the transitioning, it has to do with the gut needing to be healed. And the gut makes up 80% of the immune system. And it also controls the brain. So the very, very first step in the entire autism recovery process, and hopefully you've seen my videos in the masterclass, and I've gone through the 4 stages because, of course, there's a lot to it. And my goal is to just simplify this and help you feel confident in this process and support you as well My membership is available for those who want it. The enrollment is open now until Monday night, and I'm hoping that if you need my assistance, that you will take advantage of it, because there's so much to know, and this isn't just about diet, but diet is really important. But also keeping your child very, very well hydrated is important. Making sure they have enough water, they're even sipping little bits throughout the day. Also very, very important if your child has constipation issues, because this is a detoxification issue as well, which again, I'll get into today. But vitamin D3, and the 3 makes it the most bioabsorbable type. And vitamin D3 is one of the absolute best virus fighters and bacteria fighters available as a general, over the counter type supplement. In the program, we do use skullcap and a couple of things that are antiviral for viruses that live in the system as well, which is very important as well, because we don't want those triggered. But one thing you can do at home is make sure that your entire family is taking vitamin D3. So that's very, very important. I just want to make sure you know that. What I want to do is simplify the process. Okay, well, the first thing you want me to do, Karen, is change my child's diet. Well, they're addicted to gluten, which is the protein in wheat. So they're addicted to wheat and processed carbohydrates. They're addicted to dairy because it's loaded with sugars. And I'm going to talk about more of the specifics about why that is. But when you're actually addicted to something like that, it is like a food, like an addict who needs their fix. They're craving those foods. So this is a process that we have to do to transition them off. But it's very, very important to know that you do have to get your child off of these bad foods. And I gave you in the masterclass PDF, there was for under video 3, there was a guide to some of the better foods, the more quality foods to eat, nutrient dense, of course, organic, and then more of the foods to avoid. This is about transitioning your child and from the unhealthy foods and how to do that. And it is a slow and delicate process, and I want you to feel comfortable knowing it's not something that you have to do immediately. Some parents do, they've chosen that route, and it can be 3 or 4 days of extreme tantrums, refusal to eat, which some parents just go through, and then their child finally starts eating better foods. But it's getting their child off of the addictions, which take a few days. But I'm going to give you some good strategies to being able to move out of those bad foods. So if you haven't, this is all again to improve their digestion, their immune system, help them with calmer moods, better sleep, speech, ability to focus. I want you to know to stay strong and calm during this process. You're a leader or you wouldn't be here, and that's really, really important for you. I want to help you with some confidence in this, some strategies. And the tantrums also, because the aggressiveness issues come up, and I thought, I've got to figure this out. I don't want to just drug him and mask behaviors. I want to find out what the causes are. And that's all what I'm about really, is finding the causes of things and being able to work with those so that the body can then get all of the toxins and the inflammation out of the way and be able to be free, and who, our kids can come out and be who they are. Right now, there's a lot of stuff I call in their way. They're uncomfortable, and who wants, to not be able to sleep or speak clearly if you want to, and have things to say, or focus in a classroom and have friends, and all of those things are very important. And nobody wants to live with anxiety. That's just an internal stressor that can also trigger these PANS, flare-ups, and other things. That's why we're seeing, as your child might get stressed about something, that they can also have these flare-ups. So we'll talk about that. So now that I have spent 15 years now of complete depth of research. I wrote my book. I have my website. I have a live weekly radio show where I interview experts all the time. Hopefully you've been able to tune into some of those. Are fabulous. There's so much value there for you. But parents were, Karen, this is just so much. Can you just walk me through it? And so that's where the whole membership piece came from. And so what I want you to know now is that from the research and again, studies based on facts and information, that today my son is fully recovered. He no longer is diagnosable. And that is what's most important to me, is that my son is better. He's healthy. His anxiety, his oppositional defiance disorder, his debilitating stomach aches, his lack of ability to focus in a classroom, always getting in trouble. And people think he's a bad kid when he's an absolute sweetheart. And I hear this from parents all the time. My son is so sweet. Even though they'll have tantrums or aggressive issues, it's not that your child is angry. It's that their brain is so toxic and inflamed that they can't be themselves. And that's what we want to unleash. Now, everybody's level of recovery is different. We know that. The definition of recovery, and I always have to say this, is to regain health. It's literally in the dictionary. The definition of recovery is to regain health. And regaining health, whatever that means for autism, what happens when we heal the biology, the brain heals. Again, the toxins and the inflammation get out of the way, and your child is then able to be who they are, to sleep peacefully, to improve speech. I have parents that have told me their child who was nonverbal is now not only speaking but chatty, and they're so grateful. And aggressive kids that were once very aggressive are now calm and peaceful, and the parents are just amazed. And again, we never know what each child's level of recovery will be, but your child can get better. And if you know all of the things to do. Now, as you have seen from the masterclass, there are 4 stages to the whole recovery process. But the very first is healing the gut. Now, if you're here and you've been on the journey for a long time and you've been working with the gut for a while, that's great. I hear that from parents, but then they'll say, but my child's issues will kind of get a little bit better and then they'll get worse again. And that's because the co-infections, the toxic load, the inflammation, the things that are causing inflammation, all those things haven't gotten out of the way. But the very first step is to make sure that you're transitioning to the diet. And we're going to talk about sensory issues today, because the sensory issues go hand in hand with, of course, the toxins and the inflammation, but a lot of that starts with the gut, and the gut really needing to be healed. Not just your child eating organic and grass-fed beef and only organic fruits and vegetables and off of the processed carbohydrates and the bad foods. But if you don't have some other things in place to support detoxification and that process, then the gut can stay what we call with leaky gut. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes too, because you've probably heard of Candida. And Candida is a pathogenic microbe, and it lives in the gut and it becomes overgrown. And when it does, it will bore holes in the lining of the digestive tract. It releases toxins. And so all of these things are continuing to keep your child sick, not allowing their body to absorb nutrition, even if they're eating nutritious foods. And so these are the most problematic foods. And again, you've got them on the video 3 PDF gave you a larger list, and again, it's condensed because of only how much I could put on one page. If some people have already joined the membership, you can see on the diet page, I do 7-day meal plans, example grocery list, but we're going to talk about histamines here in a minute. And there's an entire knowledge base for histamines, because it's so important to know about foods that will trigger your child that you might be unaware of, and how to work with those, how to prepare their system, how to reduce the sensory overload. Again, so hopefully you've got your PDF download for this as well, because there are some links there on that PDF that will be really helpful for you, and even to a couple of products that I found to be very helpful in the transitioning process. And one of those helps with the sensory overload issue. So gluten, dairy, corn, soy, sugar, and all processed carbohydrates. So the reason that your child is, for one, addicted to gluten and dairy is not only is dairy loaded with natural sugars, but gluten and dairy have proteins in them, casein and gluten, that will, gluten is the protein in wheat, and casein is protein in dairy, those create opiates in the system. And yes, opiates, just like the opiate drug. Now, in a healthy individual, we're able to process those through while we detoxify. But anybody who's got a backed up detoxification system, is immunocompromised, then these build up in the system. And then it's like I said, your child might, some people say, oh, my child will only eat, breads and crackers and cakes and cookies and basically any processed carbohydrate. And they crave sugars and they want dairy, again, for the sugars. And the processed carbohydrates also turn to sugars in the body. And somebody wrote me yesterday, Karen, do I have to get rid of all these carbohydrates? Like, how will my child, be healthy off of them? We have been brought up thinking that these things are something we need, and they're not. Their grains are actually not really good for our systems even at all. So even when it's gluten-free, I tell parents, you don't really want to give those processed carbohydrates to your kid. Now, while you're transitioning, that's a different process. That's when you can go from and also that these sugars feed candida, as I was going to mention there as well. So even fruit in the beginning when you're fighting candida, yep, has to go. And parents always fight me on that one or try to. Really, are you sure? Don't they need? No, you've got to stay away from anything that puts sugar in the body. And that includes fruit, because the candida thrives on it. It causes inflammation in the gut, a lot of different things. So this few days of transitioning is really, or if you're doing it really fast, is a few days, or can be up to a couple of weeks. But to transition, one way can be getting your child, maybe you've had them they eat chicken nuggets. Okay, not a good food. They're deep fried. The batter is gluten. It's not organic. But if you can find an organic chicken nugget that has, a process, it's gluten-free and organic, or at least organic at first, even when it's still got gluten on it, you're slowly trying to move them in that direction, one step at a time. And then little by little too, as they get less addicted to those foods, and they start eating more of the good foods that are healing their gut, and you can utilize some of the other things too that I have on the PDF for you that will help with some of the sensory overload. That's really important in the beginning. I'm going to talk about that in a minute here too, because we talked about the bad bacteria thriving on sugars, the opiates, which are addictive, and then histamine sensitivities. Now, histamine could cause hyperactivity, headaches, a burning sensation on the tongue when you eat or your child eats. You might see they're really low in zinc, very common with kids on the autism spectrum, and we need zinc for so many metabolic reactions, but also it really supports the immune system. And what happens, histamines also will imbalance the copper to zinc ratio. And so what we want to do, we also might see things like hives, rashes, hyperactivity, including poor sleep. That can be caused from foods. So the histamines have to be reduced. And we're going to talk about a couple of things here that will be really helpful, because it's important to know that histamines are in the gut, but they also will affect some of the reactions in the gut, but they'll also affect detoxification. So there's two phases of detoxification in the liver. Phase 1 and 2 is what they're known as. And the histamines can block that. So, and they can build up in the brain, and it might be a 2-day delay. So your child might be eating today, and for the last couple of days, they've been fine. But what they ate 2 days ago and then yesterday is now building up enough that their system is sort of crashing on histamines. They build up in the brain. They cause, that's why you might see rashes. Sometimes your rashes often are from an eczema. Even one of our body's ways of detoxifying is through the skin. So that's why sometimes you'll see that. You might have heard of the MTHFR methylation detoxification issue. 98% of kids with autism are said to have it. It's a genetic defect, and the parents usually have it too. Now, don't worry about it. We do work within the program. What we're doing is getting the system back on track so that you don't have all of this cascade of inflammation and all of these other triggers going on. So that's what's really important. Knowing what histamine foods there are important.
So this is a slide from Karen Thomas' podcast, and she even talks about bone broth and histamine intolerance. And most people do well on it, but there is the problem: if you are histamine intolerant, then prolonged cooking or having it in the fridge for too long will cause histamine issues such as migraines, indigestion, diarrhea, bloating, and some people might even get skin issues or cold-like symptoms or muscle pain and such weird stuff that you might not know why you get that, but it is histamine related. So what she says, don't cook it for more than 4.5 hours. For me, even that is too much, so I don't do bone broth, but I think it is individually. You have to try it out, experiment what you can tolerate. And what she suggests is really a great thing. You can actually, once you have made the bone broth, you can freeze it into those ice cubes and then take one out every day. So that's a very good solution if you want to integrate bone broth in your diet.
First, calming the sensory issues in the mouth is the one that Robert says he finds in your reading for your child. Then you can go ahead and use that one instead of this. You won't need both. But otherwise, if you're the stress reducer elixir is available, and giving that to your child before they eat can help calm down some of those sensory issues that are in the mouth, because the mouth has so many senses that it will sometimes just be overwhelming for your child to eat. The texture of the food is too much for them, the taste, the everything is just uncomfortable. And they've started to associate food with fear sometimes too, because they'll know food might make their stomach hurt or give them a headache or make them anxious. So we'll talk about that in a minute too. Some things that you can do for them emotionally and for yourself, which is very important, because I'm here to support you as the parent as much as getting your child healthier and better. So it's both. I know personally how intense it can be at times to be a parent of a child with autism, and I've lived it, and that's why this is, it's so important to have support on the journey. So that's what's also making sure that you're having support for you, and making sure you take time for yourself. Even if you take a 5-minute walk every day for yourself, it's very important. Go make yourself a cup of tea, something that you feel like you're doing for you, because it's all about caregiving. And, sometimes our cup needs to be filled back up, and simple things can help do that. So you can use the stress reducer elixir too. Remember, anything you're doing for your child here, you can do for yourself and your other children and your spouse, any other family members. Please, share this with people, because it's really helpful for everybody. Usually there are other issues in the family because, our kids get things from us and we carry them. And so everybody's got them. Also, a little caveat: as you're going through the whole recovery process, I do encourage you to do this with yourself, the health aspects with yourself, because we can pass things back and forth to each other. Candida and things like that are passed through saliva. So kissing on the lips, sharing a beverage, even just sharing the same glass of water with your child or spouse or anybody like that. sharing an apple or sharing a fork or a bite of eating off your fork and then dipping it into somebody else's food with your saliva on it, you're transmitting all of the same bacteria back and forth in your family. So you really want to work with everybody and get the whole family healthy, so you're not passing this back around, and everybody can think clearly and sleep better and focus better and be calm and be able to be relaxed. So the DAO elixir is another one of Robert's elixirs that is specifically for histamine intolerance. Now, what happens is DAO is the enzyme that breaks down histamines. I don't want to get too scientific on you, but basically with the MTHFR mutation, which again 98% of kids with autism have, and not to worry, and you don't necessarily need to go do any testing or anything. Usually you already know those things are happening, pore detoxification. But DAO elixir helps instruct the body to naturally build more of those enzymes that have been degraded, so that they have more of a defense against histamines, because histamines are created from any allergic reaction, whether it's in the environment or from a food. So it's a very, very helpful thing to know about, the DAO elixir. And then I believe we have put that on your download for you. I put this testimonial from one of the members in here, because it's kind of hard to explain the elixirs, but she said, since my son has been on your program for the past few months, we've seen noticeable changes in his behavior. He's more calm than before. His speech has dramatically improved. His picky eating is very gradually getting better, and his gut seems to be healing, and he's much less aggressive. I know for you as a parent at home, if these things were happening for you with your child, you can imagine how much more beneficial, or how different, I'll say, your life could be. And for your child as well, or the whole family. I just want to say how happy we are with the progress he's made, and know it's mostly due in large part to the elixirs. They're very, very helpful.
You know, if there's one saying I can't repeat enough, it is this: food is medicine. And my guest today is living proof of the healing power of food. In 2000, actually, it's 20 years ago, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and actually within a few years, despite following phenomenal medical advice, she was confined to a wheelchair. But instead of taking the conventional approach, which clearly wasn't working, she radically transformed her diet. And within a year, she ditched her wheelchair and the cane, and was actually riding her beloved bicycle. And if you go on the internet, you can watch pictures of her. She's Dr. Terry Wahls, professor at the University of Iowa Carver College of Medicine, a best-selling author, and in my opinion, one of the foremost experts on the power of nutrition to reverse autoimmune disease. On today's show, Dr. Wahls and I are going to tackle hot topics like the keto diet and intermittent fasting, discuss whether fruit is really all it's cracked up to be, and discuss ways you can rebalance your gut microbiome for better health. Dr. Wahls, welcome back to the Dr. Gundry podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure. We always have a great time talking with you. You truly are one of the greats in this field, and it's a pleasure to talk about your new book, The Wahls Protocol, the new edition. So,
hey, thank you.
What's changed in the new Wahls Protocol?
Well, so we have a lot more ability for people to personalize the diet recommendations. So I talk about histamines, we talk about oxalates, and we talk about ketosis. I have pulled back from my original discussion of ketosis in the first book. I'm much more specific about who should be on a ketogenic diet, and that there are a wide variety of ways to get into ketosis. So we talk about time-restricted feeding, intermittent fasting, periodic fasting, and then I talk about hormesis. We've updated a discussion on metabolic resilience, on how to create more emotional resilience, the science of behavior change, and how we, because the reason most of our colleagues struggle with getting their patients to succeed is that it's really hard for people to adopt and sustain the lifestyle changes that you and I recommend. And so I've created a much more robust process to support behavior change. So we talk about that. We talk about food addiction and addiction medicine. And then finally, I have update the reader on electrical stimulation and the latest in neurorehabilitation. So all in all, it's over a third new material.
You know, that's one of the things I so much respect about you is that you're willing to make changes in your teachings, in your philosophies, based on research that wasn't available to you or me even a few years ago.
Yeah.
And based on the results of your practice with patients. And
in our clinical trials.
Yeah,
so
that's exactly right.
We're getting ready to start our 5th clinical trial. So these 10 years, we've made a lot of progress. We have a lot more insight as to how to help people adopt and sustain these changes. And we have more insight in terms of what happens as people adopt and then sustain these changes.
So, keto wasn't a big part of, your original book. Tell me what's changed your mind, or where does keto fit in this whole process? Let's start there.
Well, certainly ketogenic eating is something our ancestors did. They were in ketosis a lot, either because of the prolonged physical activity, which depletes your glycogen stores and puts you into ketosis, or because of winter, drought, war, famine, that there's not food, and so you're in ketosis on that basis. And the science is very clear that being in ketosis does shift a lot of chemistry in very helpful ways. And so there's a bunch of research on the benefits of ketogenic eating for neurodegeneration, cognitive decline, and certainly seizure disorder and cancers. And I certainly still talk about that research and stand behind all of that. However, there's also more research on the benefit of metabolic switching, of being in a ketogenic state because of either physical activity or absence of food, and then resting and eating and letting your cells replenish the glycogen, burn carbs or burn amino acids. And so we're switching between a ketogenic state and a non-ketogenic state. And that switching does even better things for our brain and better things for our mitochondrial efficiencies than being in a prolonged ketogenic state. So now my preference is that I want people to be in ketosis intermittently. And you can do that either on a daily basis through time-restricted feeding, or a weekly basis through sort of a 5-2 intermittent fasting, or a periodic basis, so periodic fast, or you could do it a seasonal ketosis. And I think in general, that's my preferred strategy. There are clinical circumstances, though, where I will still put someone in ketosis and leave them in ketosis forever.
And what that you said, histamine. Histamine is a huge deal when it comes to any sort of dyspepsia, functional gut disorders, all the way from simple histamine intolerance and SIBO all the way to mast cell activation syndrome, which is really prevalent in chronic SIBO cases.
Especially if there's any signs like family history of gluten, celiac tendency, like thyroid antibodies, which are, to me, I use thyroid antibodies as almost as a vicarious like gluten marker because they're so closely tied with gluten sensitivity. That's my experience.
That's a novel way of using it.
Yeah, well, as a clinical, so here's an interesting statistic, which I think I've got close to right. I'm going to say some numbers, so hopefully I've got these right. But, if you check the celiac genotype or haplotype, which is actually a fair number of the population, then if you're positive for that, then I think it's still only about a 1 in 20 chance that you will get celiac disease, but there's a 1 in 2 chance that you'll get Hashimoto's thyroid disease, with that haplotype. So, and that's the same haplotype or genotype that's been quite closely correlated with endometriosis. So I'm kind of looking for signs of that autoimmunity, whether autoimmune in the family, other autoimmune conditions going on. If that's there, then I really do potentially need them to get strictly off gluten and A1 casein, dairy. And at the same time, coming in with the antimicrobial, considering other food issues, which could be histamine, could sometimes in some cases eggs are another.
Eggs are big, yeah.
Yeah, they're a big one for some people. I look for a history of childhood eczema to try to inform me if eggs are likely to be a problem. Now I'm going to be thinking a bit more about this nickel allergy. I'm going to actually be asking women about nickel allergies, like if they react to jewelry, and thinking about that. What's interesting in this paper that we'll put in the notes, just to circle right back to this nickel allergy paper that I mentioned at the beginning, they look at the list of foods that have nickel and kind of cross-reference that with gluten-free, dairy-free, and FODMAP. And so wheat is quite high in nickel, apparently. So you've got wheat is in all three categories, right? Wheat is gluten, FODMAP, and high nickel. Then you've got tomatoes.
And glyphosate very often, right?
Yeah, that too. And then you've got tomatoes, which are quite high nickel, especially if they're canned or tinned.
Huh.
And their histamine. They don't talk about histamine in that paper, but there's like a bit of overlap between these diets. So you get people, it's like, whoa, they feel so much better off wheat, dairy, and tomatoes. It's like, well, why is that? You know, is that nickel? Is that just the antigenic proteins? Is it a FODMAP thing?
If you wonder what FODMAP means, it's fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And more often than not, if you have a histamine intolerance, you may react to so-called FODMAP foods. So I found out about fructans, which also belong to the FODMAPs, and removed all of those. And I really saw those extreme reactions in fermented foods like sauerkraut and vinegar and stuff like that when I tried the GAPS diet. So of course I stopped and went carnivore, but I still had some issues, and that's what led me to look into histamine intolerance. So it says high histamine types may or may not have mutations in DAO or HNMT. If they do, they frequently have high histamine in their blood because either they produce histamine at a more rapid rate. I think this is certainly the case in my body. Or they don't break down histamine as quickly as other people. High histamine release has also shown to involve increased levels of glutamate, which is a problematic neurotransmitter, because when there is too much of it, tends to overload the NMDA receptor, leading to cell programmed death, especially of nerve cells. Here's a short list of high glutamate foods: cured meats, tomatoes, mushrooms, broccoli, peas, anything with MSG or any of MSG's disguised names. Which is interesting. My body really reacted to MSGs with a migraine, and when I tried that sulforaphane product, which is derived from broccoli, It gave me severe bloating and also migraines. And I also got some reaction from tomatoes when I ate too much of it. My mouth felt sore, but mushrooms were kind of okay. But definitely also I cannot eat any bacon or any other cured meat or processed meat. Not even dehydrated meat. So it further says, another significant finding is dopamine dominance. People that are dopamine dominant are very interesting people. They are very analytical, are driven and motivated at succeeding, and they may inadvertently have reward orientations due to dopamine hyperstimulation. I'm certainly not one of those. They are driven by stress and can get burnt out by stress if they aren't careful. Well, who can't get burned out by stress? I think that's the case for everybody. People that are dopamine dominant frequently have COMT, homozygous gene mutations. This is the enzyme that degrades dopamine. Sometimes dopamine dominant people can exhibit copper toxicity symptoms. This is because copper converts dopamine into noradrenaline. Interesting. So this was the connection between FODMAPs and histamine intolerance. Karen Thomas also mentions the ABA therapies, and many autistics, or practically most, are against it, and this is why. It can be actually traumatizing if the issue is not cognitive but actually rather an issue of inflammation. Then no matter how much you try, you just can't. And it's frustrating. And then therapists may even go as far as do some gaslighting. But the real issue here is inflammation. So it's very important to first get off all of those inflammatory foods, what she mentions: sugar, carbohydrates, even fruit, and wheat, gluten. For some it's dairy too. Get off of those foods, and then you will see some changes happening. I'm sure of it. And after that, you can still go back and do some cognitive therapies, somatic experience, sensory motor psychotherapy, which includes body and mind. Doesn't matter, but first you have to really introduce the right foods so your body can heal.
I didn't know at the time that his brain was so toxic and inflamed that he couldn't do what was asked of him. Now today, now that he's recovered, his gut is healed, the toxins and inflammation are gone, he has an incredibly high IQ. He's graduating from college next month in May, and he lives on his own 800 miles away from me in his own apartment, completely independently, and he's fine. And that's what we want to really create as much independence for your child as possible. Make them indistinguishable on a schoolyard from others. You know, we're not trying to change who they are. What we want to do is allow them to be who they are. Right now, what's happening is all this stuff is in the way. And when we try to force therapies on them or push therapies on them, when they're having a hard time doing it, or before we have healed up the gut and a lot of the co-infections and quit a lot of the toxins, later on, honestly, you're going to get more for your money than you are now, and it'll be easier on your child because they'll be capable of it. Now, I'm going to say something that when I say this, when I speak in public at large events, that I get a big gasp in the room. That we pulled my son out of therapies when I realized it just wasn't working for him. I then spent a couple of years or so healing him up, figuring it all out. And my son never had to go back to therapies, any of them. He didn't ever need them again. That was all because his brain was so toxic and inflamed. And when that went away, he didn't need them. Now, I'm saying that was our situation and what happened with us. But I don't know that will be the case for you or your child. But I'm saying that so that you know that how much better they can be later after all of this the toxins and inflammation are out of their way. They actually can become who they are.